Thank you very much, Nick, Jack, Robert. Thank you very much for being here and inviting me to this conference. I have to say, though, I'm a bit at a disadvantage here, for I am neither a historian nor a celebrated ambassador or policymaker of any kind. And to make matters much worse, I'm also a political scientist, so that makes me immediately less interesting than everybody else on this panel, so I apologize in advance for that. As a political scientist, though, what I'm interested in trying to do, to the extent that I can, is create a generalizable theory. So one of the things that interests me about this case is precisely where Jack left off. What can we learn from this case and then apply to other cases that might be similar or different to it? And what I'm going to talk about today is actually part of a larger book project. And the book is trying to essentially create a theory of face-to-face diplomacy. The puzzle that the book addresses is this basic idea that face-to-face diplomacy has long been one of the most prevalent practices in international politics. Some might even say the linchpin of world politics. Yet for a variety of reasons, scholars of international relations have tended to dismiss it. They dismiss it for some good reasons, such as the idea that it can be cheap talk, that you can lie in a face-to-face interaction, and also for structural reasons, which is simply to say that state power matters a lot more than what any one individual or any two individuals are going to say to each other. Now, the problem with this, I think, is that if you discount diplomacy in international relations, as we've done, we then stand in contrast to what statesmen have essentially argued for centuries, which is that there's no substitute for personally meeting a counterpart and hashing out an agreement. Sitting down with somebody, looking them in the eye and talking it out oftentimes is very successful according to people who actually do this for a living. And so that means that either statesmen are incredibly naive or that we're wrong. And I think the answer is that we're wrong. And so in my book, I want to suggest the reasons that we're wrong and try to figure out why it is, in particular, that these diplomatic face-to-face interactions are so important and why statesmen are so keen to engage in them. So the theoretical argument, before I turn to Geneva, just very quickly, is that the pessimism, I think, surrounding diplomacy and face-to-face personal diplomacy in particular is rooted in a particular set of assumptions that we make about the nature of social interaction. The conventional wisdom of political science and a lot of other places posits that our intentions, our sincere sort of beliefs and intentions, are fundamentally inaccessible. And they're inaccessible because they exist in the minds of other people, and we can't read minds, and so therefore we have to fall back on doing other types of analysis, like counting up capabilities or looking at what people have said and trying to decipher what they truly mean and believe. And this is what philosophers talk about as the problem of other minds, that essentially you just can't read other people's minds, and so therefore we can never really know what other people are thinking. And the problem, of course, is that since we can't know what people are thinking, we tend to look for other things. And this process is prone to a lot of misperceptions, a lot of imprecision, a lot of error along the lines of the things that we were talking about this morning, where the CIA was just getting things wrong. Trying to understand what the Soviet intentions were from Washington was not working out all that well. And I think that's sort of emblematic of this idea that it's just really, really hard to get at the intentions of states. The Able Archer problematique is an excellent example of this, where neither side was really sure what the other was doing. So what are their intentions with these military exercises? But the solution that I turn to really involves a lot of different types of evidence that have been collected over several decades of research in psychology and neuroscience, which basically says that this conventional wisdom about the problem of other minds might need a relook. And it needs a relook because there is some evidence to suggest that we don't necessarily need to theorize or infer or sort of make assumptions about the assumptions of other people, that instead, through a process of empathy, we can actually simulate the intentions of other people for ourselves. And in face-to-face interactions in particular, this is aided because we have a rich visual environment to work off of. And it turns out that if you look in the brain, that there is some evidence that there are discrete brain architecture to help us do this, right? So one of the ideas here is that face-to-face interaction is incredibly important for social interaction. If we didn't have the ability to read the intentions of other people, social interaction would be almost impossible, right? So we kind of need this from an evolutionary and social perspective. And what ends up happening in face-to-face interactions, I argue, is we see advanced neural synchronization, meaning that there's a certain level of mirroring that goes on between the individuals who are engaged in a face-to-face encounter. And this allows them to understand the intentions of each other better than our traditional models would suggest. So in behavioral terms, they do these studies where they have people negotiate face-to-face, and it turns out those people can predict the intentions and the reserve prices and all kinds of other things better than through other interaction modalities. And I think this is really important. It's really sort of an interesting insight that hasn't been applied yet to international relations. And I think it allows us to think about face-to-face diplomacy as a discrete activity that is generalizable and can be applied to lots of different cases. So one of the cases that face-to-face diplomacy is particularly useful for is instances where leaders want to convey their sincere intentions to the other. And so as I'm arguing in a minute, I think this is what was happening in Geneva, where Gorbachev and Reagan really wanted to reassure each other of their benign intentions. They had trouble doing so through previous periods of history, precisely because in Moscow and in Washington they were getting the information wrong, and so they both wanted to signal as clearly as possible to the other that they wanted to cooperate at some level, but most importantly, their intentions were benign. Face-to-face interaction, though, also helps diplomats and leaders sort of read between the lines. So in diplomacy, oftentimes leaders will not want to convey their intentions, preferring instead to kind of keep them shielded or close to the vest. And what face-to-face interaction allows in these instances is to kind of get a glimpse behind what's going on in the backstage. Irving Goffman famously referred to this as the backstage of social interaction, where there might be some things that you believe but you don't necessarily want to get out. Face-to-face interaction is a nice opportunity to see that backstage from time to time. And the most pernicious form of this, of course, is deception, where you're holding a belief in your head that you clearly don't want the other person to know, but you also tell them the opposite. So my intention is X, I intend to do actually something else. And it turns out face-to-face interaction might help us to get around that problem in some instances as well. So I think in short, the general sort of theoretical framework that I'm working on, or working with here, is that face-to-face encounters are a unique form of social interaction. They problematize the notion that intentions are fundamentally unknowable, and this is an important assumption that we often make in international relations. I'm also, with Nick and with a few other people, thinking about the international system as an interpersonal one. If we really want to understand outcomes in international politics, we have to get down to this micro level interpersonal dynamic because, as Jack was just mentioning, I think it explains a lot about the way international politics plays out. But it's also important to remember that while face-to-face interactions can result in increased empathy, which I think about as the ability to understand the cognitive and affective states of other people, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is always going to be a good thing, right? This can lead to trust in some instances, but it also lead to deception. It can lead to lots of other less desirable outcomes. So face-to-face interaction is not necessarily always normatively positive, and I think that's important to keep in mind. So I think what we see in Geneva, which I want to turn to in a second, is we see a lot of empathy. We see a lot of understanding of others, both cognitive and affective states. And I think ultimately we probably do see the beginning of trust, which Nick will get to in his book ultimately. Now, when I present this research to policymakers, I often get the reaction that this intuitively makes a lot of sense, that face-to-face diplomacy does provide the ability to achieve things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve. And I think this is because policymakers, statesmen have a sort of feel for the game. They have a sense of what to do. They have a sense of what works and what doesn't work. In a sense, what I'm trying to do with this theory is unpack this feel for the game, unpack what's going on in these interactions, and I think that tells us something about why diplomats and leaders push for these interactions themselves. All right, so turning to Geneva in particular, which is one of the cases that I look at, you think about what was going on before Geneva, as the first panel this morning did, and what we see is in Washington and Moscow, a lot of assessing specific intentions from afar. You know, they're looking at this period as not being really sure of the other. They're assuming certain things. They're making bad assumptions, as people have pointed out. And both sides seem to understand the need to sit down, at least Gorbachev and Reagan did. But there were also people in Washington, importantly, who were sure of Gorbachev. They knew exactly what he was all about, right? I think you read some of the memoirs of people during the time, and there's a lot of people who were relatively certain about what Gorbachev was up to, although they had never met him or didn't have any sort of serious interaction with him. Reagan himself was a little bit on the fence. He says in his memoirs, if he wasn't, referring to Gorbachev, a confirmed ideologue, he would never have been chosen. Further noting that I'm too cynical to believe that Gorbachev is different than past leaders. Now, I know Jack tried to disabuse Reagan of this notion that the Russians feared war just as much as we did. They didn't intend to go to war, but I think one of the prevailing sort of feelings at the time was that actually what the Soviets were doing was being deceptive. So this is by an NSC staffer in December 1984. The principal theme of Soviet strategic deception is to convince us that the political transformation of the U.S. is not a Soviet objective. So to the extent that Gorbachev was saying the right things, this was a ploy. It was a trick. The document goes on, the very act of sitting at a negotiating table accomplishes this task by leading us to believe that a live and let live policy is acceptable to the Soviets when in fact it is not acceptable whatsoever. So I think here you see that sort of reticence to engage in face-to-face interaction, because if it's a trick, if it's an act of deception, you're going to be in trouble. Now, these people are making claims about Gorbachev's specific intentions, but they're doing it from Washington. They're not meeting. And to me, this is really important. And I want to point also that not everybody felt this way about Gorbachev. There was a lot of discussion about it. But as the backdrop, I think something that was said earlier was the CIA gets an F. One of the reasons they get an F is because they weren't interacting with Soviet leaders as much as they could have been or should have been. On the other side, Gorbachev's initial impressions of Reagan were not necessarily that favorable as well. At Chernenko's funeral, Gorbachev reportedly got the impression that the American delegation was to be honest, quite mediocre. This is not a very serious team. And so neither side really had a good sense, I don't think, of the other before they get into Geneva, although Reagan and Gorbachev seem to be open to the idea that they might be convinced otherwise. So at their first meeting in Geneva on November 19th, it had been booked by the handlers for about 15 minutes, but it lasted about an hour. Reagan began by offering a very specific goal for the summit, which is to eliminate the suspicions each side has of the other. Reagan argued that substantive discussions on complex topics such as arms could not occur if both sides were suspicious of one another. As he was fond of saying, countries don't mistrust each other because of armaments, they build up their armaments because they mistrust each other. For Gorbachev, it was also crucial to convey to Reagan that he was being sincere. As Rhodes argues, the Soviet Union wasn't playing a game with the United States. It wasn't being duplicitous. If it harbored secret intentions, then the relationship couldn't be improved. Gorbachev, looking back on these initial interactions at Geneva, says that he really gained the ability, in a sense, to put himself in Reagan's place. Right? And this is what empathy really is. It's understanding the other person by simulating what it's like to be them. Referencing Geneva as well, he developed an intuition about Reagan. Our dialogue was very constructive and increasingly friendly the better we got to know each other. But I think the really key interaction from that first Geneva meeting came on the second day, and it's when Reagan was posed a direct question by Gorbachev regarding Soviet intentions. Why don't you believe me when I say the Soviet Union will never attack, demanded Gorbachev. Please answer me, Mr. President. What is your answer? I want an answer from you. Why don't you believe me? And Reagan responded, look, no one can say to the American people that they should rely on personal faith rather than sound defense. Gorbachev's response, why should I accept your sincerity on your willingness to share SDI research when you don't even share advanced technology with your allies? Let's be more realistic. We're prepared to compromise. And after some clarification of the Soviet offer that cuts the nuclear arsenal if the U.S. were to give up an SDI, there was a pause, about 30 seconds, according to Schultz. And Gorbachev reflected and said, Mr. President, I don't agree with you, but I can see you really mean what you say. And he softened the tone at that point. Maybe this has all grown a little heated. I was just trying to convey to you the depth of our concern on SDI. So I think it's a really important moment of both sides clarifying to each other what their intentions actually are. In the words of Rhodes, Gorbachev apparently realized that Reagan no more intended to use nuclear weapons than he did. Both men, each in his own way, were scouting a path out of the Minotaur's lair. So the U.S. really saw this, I think, as a turning point. It was the first time the Soviets had allowed the U.S. to get a sense of their sincere intentions. Gorbachev seemed to be thinking more in the long term, according to Reagan, and would not let disagreement over SDI in particular jeopardize the relationship that was transforming. And it seemed to me also that the Soviets understood that the U.S., their intention was not offensive either at this point. It was rather defensive. So Gorbachev might have thought that SDI was a misguided policy. He might have thought it was silly, but he understood Reagan's sincerity about it. Gorbachev said the human factor had quietly come into action. We both sensed that we must maintain contact and try to avoid a break. With respect to their specific intentions, Reagan used the face-to-face meetings as a way to convince Gorbachev that we wanted peace and they had nothing to fear from us. So one of the sticking points for Gorbachev, of course, was not necessarily Reagan, but it was who would replace him. So there's this problem of intentions also as this diachronic issue where Gorbachev asks Reagan to put himself in his shoes, to try to simulate his position, to realize the feeling of insecurity that such a position entails for once Reagan is out of office, we don't know what's going to happen. Neither Gorbachev nor Reagan can guarantee anything about the future relationship of the two countries, who would be making decisions in the future. Reagan seemed to understand this difficulty at Geneva. Future uncertainty was about trust, and it seems to me that trust had not yet developed, although we might be on the way to creating trust. As Jack mentioned, the joint communique that followed the summit put into words what both sides had agreed to. A nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought, and neither would seek to achieve military superiority. Now, I think while Geneva had been an important first step, it's not completely able to resolve differences or really engender significant trust at this point. As Jack has said, that Reagan and Gorbachev had different ideas of what it would take to build trust. Gorbachev was looking to Reagan to pull back SDI. Reagan believed that SDI was a defensive measure that was needed in order to have peace. But the distance between the two from a position perspective was significant, but they were growing closer interpersonally, Schultz says, I was surprised and encouraged as much by the obvious rapport between the two men as by their quick agreement without hesitation on reciprocal visits for the two follow-on summit meetings. Shortly after the summit, Gorbachev reported to Chernayev that a spark of electric mutual trust ignited between us like a voltaic arc between two poles. But clarifying what this was based on, Chernayev notes that Reagan was able to move beyond his rhetoric and convey his actual sincere belief in the possibility of dealing with the Soviet Union. Most importantly, Chernayev realized that the assessments that the Soviet Union had made of Reagan and U.S. intentions were likely wrong. I quote, "From a Soviet leader for Gorbachev, for the first time, he got a sense that there is something deeply wrong in our general evaluation of the American administration and American life, that our class analysis is failing and does not give us an answer that would provide a good basis for any kind of realistic politics." Or put another way, as James has argued, at Geneva, the President and First Lady became John and Sally from Reagan's Yvonne and Anya speech. Two couples spoke not about differences but shared values and affectation for their children and grandchildren. So I think at the end of the day, Reagan and Gorbachev were starting to build at Geneva an understanding of one another. Gorbachev is a somewhat different breed, even though he solidly believes in their system, Reagan wrote. He had a changed perspective of what Gorbachev was all about. Schultz, in reflecting on the summit, notes the importance of the meeting and getting both Reagan and Gorbachev to see each other as people, not simply as objects or policies. And Reagan himself echoed these sentiments in a February 1986 letter to his Russian specialist, Suzanne Massey. "I'm not going to let myself get euphoric, but still I have a feeling that we might be at the point of beginning." There did seem to be something of a chemistry between the General Secretary and myself. With respect to Gorbachev's sincerity and reflecting on his interactions with the Soviet leader, Reagan had a new belief instilled in him after Geneva. This guy means it. He's going to put his money where his mouth is, in reference to a private discussion he had, and to teach our children to love one another. Massey credits Reagan's confidence in his instincts, his ability to work on his intuition, and so on and so forth. And for his part, Gorbachev felt similarly. According to Hartman, Gorbachev decided that Reagan meant what he said at Geneva, and Reagan did want to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and he was deadly serious about SDI. And just in closing, I agree with Jack that perhaps the most important thing that happened at Geneva was a commitment to keep talking. Gorbachev appealed to Reagan for a follow-up face-to-face meeting, intuiting that he needs to understand whether U.S. leadership is really willing to seek agreements, which would lead to a termination of the arms race and to genuine disarmament. And of course, Reagan did agree to this, and Reykjavik would follow the following year. So just in conclusion, I think as a general principle, face-to-face interactions in diplomacy are very important. And I think they're important because they allow each side to convey their sincere intentions to another. You can do this without trust, but I think it is a building block of trust. So to trust, you have to empathize with the other. And I think ultimately that's largely what face-to-face interactions are about. It also helps us, this theoretical perspective, I think, articulate what this human factor, what this chemistry, what this bonding is all about. Gorbachev mentions it quite a bit. But it's hard to really pin down what exactly that means. And I think looking to psychology and some of the neuroscience helps us get an understanding of what this means. And it might also help us understand how to improve U.S.-Russian relations today by infusing more empathy, by engendering more face-to-face interactions, and hoping that that can build a little bit of trust down the road. Thank you.